The dry, cracked earth of Dry Creek seemed to swallow up the heat of the day, turning the very air into a blanket of discomfort. Dust swirled through the streets like ghosts of forgotten stories, caught in the heat that pressed against everything. The town itself, small as it was, appeared almost suffocated by the dry, oppressive atmosphere. The buildings stood like silent sentinels, worn by years of sun and wind. The paint on their wooden facades faded to the color of bone. And in the middle of it all, the town square, or what passed for one, was alive with an energy that wasn't common in this quiet, isolated place. Today was different. Today the air crackled with tension. It wasn't a festival or celebration. No, it was something darker. A spectacle was unfolding, one that had drawn every person from the saloon to the general store, to the patch of dirt that passed for a gathering place in Dry Creek. Out in the center of this dusty square stood a man, shackled and chained, as the crowd buzzed with whispers and murmurs. His name was Samuel Tallbear, and he stood tall, his broad shoulders square and unmoving under the weight of the chains that clinked softly with each shift of his posture. His dark eyes scanned the crowd, not with fear, but with an air of quiet defiance. The kind of defiance you see in a man who knows his fate is sealed but refuses to bow to it. The sheriff, a bulky man named McKenna, stood beside him, his badge glinting in the harsh sunlight as he addressed the gathering crowd. "Step right up, folks," the sheriff bellowed, his voice booming across the square like a carnival barker. "We've got ourselves a genuine wild one here. Caught him stealing horses from the Matt Ranch, and the judge says he's to be sold to cover the damages." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and a few voices could be heard spitting out insults. "Savage," someone hissed. "Beast," another added. The words stung, but Samuel didn't flinch, not even as the crowd began to gather closer, eyeing him like he was nothing more than cattle, ready to be sold. The sheriff wasn't looking for justice. He was looking for a sale. $50 to start," McKenna called out, his voice slick with the satisfaction of a good deal. "Who'll give me 50 for this strong back? Put him to work in the mines, or maybe breaking horses. Lord knows these savages are good with animals." It was in that moment, with the crowd chattering and the sun beating down like an unyielding judge, that Clara Whitford stepped forward. She was a widow, known by most in Dry Creek, her ranch on the outskirts of town struggling, barely hanging on. But Clara was different. She wasn't like the other women in Dry Creek who held their tongues and hid behind their husbands. Clara stood tall, her auburn hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, her green eyes fierce with a fire that couldn't be ignored. "I'll buy him," Clara's voice rang clear through the murmur of the crowd. A hush fell. It wasn't the kind of thing you heard often in Dry Creek, a woman speaking up like that, and certainly not a woman willing to buy a man who had been branded a thief, a savage, by the very people standing around her. The sheriff raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by her offer. "Now, Mrs. Whitford," he said with a sly grin, "this ain't no charity case. This man is dangerous." Clara didn't waver. She reached into her worn leather purse and pulled out a small cloth bundle, the coins inside rattling softly. "I'll give you 70, she said, her voice unwavering. "Everything I have." The crowd erupted in disbelief. Some shook their heads, muttering under their breath. Others gasped. But Clara stood firm, her gaze never leaving Samuel. And for the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Maybe surprise, maybe curiosity, but whatever it was a spark. A spark that had been buried under years of cruelty and mistreatment, but now, in this moment, was beginning to flicker back to life. McKenna took the coins, his fingers trembling slightly as he counted them, clearly hoping Clara was short, but when the count came up true, He grumbled and handed her the bill of sale. "You can pick him up in an hour," he muttered, clearly unhappy with the turn of events. Clara turned to Samuel then, her hand steady as she reached for the chains. She could feel the weight of the crowd's eyes on her, the judgment pressing down like a storm. But Clara had borne heavier burdens. She had buried her husband 3 years ago, the man she had loved, and now she was determined to save this man. Not because she thought it was the right thing to do, but because she saw something in him worth saving. "Come with me," she said softly to Samuel. And when he didn't move, she didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She just waited until he finally nodded, and together they walked through the crowd. It was a small act in the grand scheme of things, but it was a powerful one. In that moment, Clara wasn't just saving Samuel Tallbear. She was reminding herself that no matter how much the world tried to break you, there was still a chance for redemption, for change. And that was something worth fighting for. As they walked toward her ranch, Clara didn't look back. The townsfolk could say what they wanted. They could call her a fool, they could call her crazy, but Clara Whitford had made a choice, and she wasn't about to let anyone, not even the judgment of a whole town, make her regret it.
There were moments in life when you see something that stops you in your tracks, forces you to question everything you thought you knew. In Dry Creek, on a day thick with dust and tension, that moment came for Clara Whitford. The sheriff, a man whose rough hands were accustomed to holding the law in the palm of his hand, stood beside a man named Samuel Tallbear. He was a stranger to most in the town, and the few who did know him had branded him a savage for reasons they never cared to explain. It didn't matter that Samuel was a man, a person with a past, a story. No, to the people of Dry Creek, he was a wild one, someone to be feared, to be sold, to be controlled. The sheriff, his badge gleaming in the hot sun, was preparing to auction Samuel off like cattle, his voice carrying over the crowd. $50 to start, McKenna called out, his words slicing through the thick air. Put this strong back to work. Mines, horses, doesn't matter. These savages are good with animals. The crowd murmured in agreement, their eyes cold and judgmental. But Clara didn't join in with the rest. Clara was different. She wasn't like the other women in town, quietly following the rules that had been set long before them. No, she was a widow, and a strong one at that. Her ranch was hanging by a thread, barely scraping by. She didn't have much left, but what she did have was her heart, and that heart refused to stand by and watch an innocent man be sold for the crime of existing in a world that never gave him a fair chance. She stepped forward, her boots kicking up the dust, and the crowd fell silent. "I'll buy him," Clara said, her voice steady, firm, unwavering. There was a pause. You could almost hear the collective breath of the town hold in their lungs. The sheriff looked at her, a chuckle escaping his lips. "Now, Mrs. Whitford," he said, the amusement evident in his tone, "this man's a criminal." Clara didn't flinch. She wasn't here to explain herself to anyone. "I'll pay 70, she said, reaching into her worn leather purse, pulling out a bundle of coins. "Everything I have. $70 for his freedom." The crowd was stunned into silence. $70 for a man who was nothing more than property to them? Clara didn't care. Her decision had been made. The sheriff reluctantly accepted the money, counting it with exaggerated care, hoping to find a few coins missing. When it came up true, he grumbled and handed Clara the bill of sale, still shaking his head as though he was trying to convince himself that she had lost her mind. "You can take him in an hour," McKenna muttered, obviously displeased, but unable to argue with the law. Clara turned to Samuel then. His dark eyes met hers, and for the first time, there was something there, something softer, something like hope. But not just hope for him. There was hope for her, too. She wasn't just saving Samuel Tolbear from being sold like an animal. No, she was saving herself, saving her heart, her soul, saving the part of her that had died when her husband passed, leaving her to fend for a ranch that was slowly crumbling under the weight of her grief. And in Samuel, Clara saw a chance to rebuild something real, something good. "Come with me," she said, gently, as if speaking to a frightened animal. Samuel hesitated for only a moment before he nodded, his shackles rattling as he stepped forward, the weight of the chains almost as heavy as the judgment of the crowd. Together they walked through the square. The people parted like the Red Sea, but they didn't look at them with the reverence they gave Moses. No, their eyes were filled with contempt, judgment, and disbelief. But Clara didn't look back. She didn't care about their whispers or their looks. She was walking towards something more important, towards a future that was waiting to be built, even if it had to be built alone, one small act of courage at a time. And maybe, just maybe, Samuel would build it with her. The walk to Clara's ranch was long and quiet. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the dusty road. As they walked, Samuel's chains clinked softly with every step. But Clara didn't mind. Each sound was a reminder that she had done something right. She wasn't just a widow struggling to keep a failing ranch afloat. Now she was a woman who had seen something worth saving, and she had acted. When they reached the ranch, Clara didn't look back at the town. She didn't need to. The ranch was all that mattered now. It was where she would find purpose again, where she would build something real, something that could withstand the world's judgment. And for the first time in years, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope that Samuel would not only help her rebuild the ranch, but that together they could rebuild each other.
It's funny how the hardest times can sometimes show you the deepest truths. For Clara, her life had been a series of small battles, each one chipping away at the life she and Jacob had dreamed of together. The ranch, once vibrant and full of life, was now a place slowly crumbling under the weight of time and sorrow. I remember the first time I saw her, walking through that dusty town square, a woman with eyes that had seen too much. But there was something in her eyes that told me she wasn't going to give up, not without a fight. And Samuel, well, he wasn't much different. A man of few words, but those words were enough to know that his life had been one of survival, not living. In a way, he and Clara were both fighting the same fight. They just didn't know it yet. On that ranch, they started out as strangers, two people who had nothing in common except their pain. Clara, still mourning the loss of her husband Jacob, and Samuel, a man whose past was full of scars that couldn't be seen but could certainly be felt. But life has a funny way of bringing people together. As Clara tended to the ranch, repairing fences, tending to the few crops that were still alive, Samuel was always there beside her, his strong hands working alongside hers. His touch was careful yet sure, as though he understood the land in a way no one else could. Maybe that's what Clara needed, someone who could see the land for what it was, not just a source of work, but a partner in this fight for survival. I remember the first time I saw her, walking through that dusty town square, a woman with eyes that had seen too much. But there was something in her eyes that told me she wasn't going to give up, not without a fight. And Samuel, well, he wasn't much different. A man of few words, but those words were enough to know that his life had been one of survival, not living. In a way, he and Clara were both fighting the same fight. They just didn't know it yet. On that ranch, they started out as strangers, two people who had nothing in common except their pain. Clara, still mourning the loss of her husband Jacob, and Samuel, a man whose past was full of scars that couldn't be seen but could certainly be felt. But life has a funny way of bringing people together. As Clara tended to the ranch, repairing fences, tending to the few crops that were still alive, Samuel was always there beside her, his strong hands working alongside hers. His touch was careful yet sure, as though he understood the land in a way no one else could. Maybe that's what Clara needed, someone who could see the land for what it was, not just a source of work, but a partner in this fight for survival. I remember one day Clara was repairing a broken fence by the north pasture. The wood was old, the nails rusted, and the posts were leaning dangerously. It wasn't just a fence that needed mending. It was everything. Her life, the ranch, the memory of Jacob. She worked in silence, the weight of it all pressing down on her. Then Samuel appeared beside her, holding a fresh bundle of wood, ready to help. "You've been through a lot," he said, his voice rough, but there was a softness there too. "I know how hard this is." Clara paused, looking at him, the exhaustion in her eyes telling a story without words. "It's not just the work," she replied, her voice low. "It's the losing, over and over. First it was Jacob, and now it feels like I'm losing everything else." Samuel nodded. "Sometimes the land takes more than it gives, but it can give back too. You just have to keep at it." And keep at it she did. With Samuel by her side, Clara began to rebuild. Not just the fences or the barns, but something more important. She started to rebuild herself. It wasn't easy, but then nothing worth having ever is. They worked side by side, sometimes in silence, other times sharing stories. And it was during those quiet moments that Clara began to open up. Slowly, at first, like the ground softening after a long drought. "I didn't want to lose Jacob," she said one evening, as they sat together outside the barn, watching the last rays of the sun fade behind the mountains. Her eyes were distant, lost in the past, but now it feels like it was all for nothing. Samuel, wiping the sweat from his brow, didn't say anything for a moment. He just sat there, listening, and that's when Clara realized something. He wasn't just hearing her pain, he was feeling it too. She wasn't the only one with scars. "You didn't lose everything," Samuel said finally, his voice soft but sure. "You still have this ranch. You still have this land." He looked at the fence they had just fixed together, standing tall against the evening wind. "And you have yourself." It was strange how those words, so simple, could mean so much. Maybe Samuel didn't realize it, but what he was saying wasn't just about the ranch or the land. It was about Clara finding a reason to keep going, a reason to fight. And fight she did. Each day as the work on the ranch continued, so did the bond between Clara and Samuel. They weren't just fixing fences and mending barns anymore. They were building a life together, one small act of care at a time. Clara found herself telling him more about Jacob, about the dreams they had shared for the ranch. She spoke of the mornings spent in the garden, the plans for the future that now felt so distant. But with Samuel's quiet presence, she began to believe again. In return, Samuel shared what he could, not much, but enough. He spoke of his family, his people, his childhood, of the land that had been stolen from them, of the pain of losing everything and finding a way to survive, to keep going. It wasn't the life he had chosen, but it was the life he had been given. "I know what it's like to lose," Clara told Samuel one night, his voice heavy with experience. "But you can't let it define you. It's what you do after the loss that matters." And there it was, the turning point. Clara realized that Samuel wasn't just some man who had been bought and brought to the ranch. He was someone who understood, who had felt the sting of the world's unfairness, just like she had. They were both rebuilding, him from a past that refused to let go, and her from a future that had slipped through her fingers. As the days passed, they grew closer, working together, living together, sharing not just the labor, but the healing. Samuel fixed the barns, mended the fences, and helped clear the land. Clara tended to the garden, the animals, and the house. Each day felt like a small victory, and for the first time in years, Clara didn't feel alone. The ranch wasn't just a place for them to survive anymore. It had become a place for them to heal, together. And in that healing, they began to find hope again, not just for the land, but for each other. It was in the small moments, the way Samuel's hands carefully repaired the fence, the way Clara's smile began to come back, faint but real, that Clara realized something. She wasn't just saving the ranch, she was saving herself. And in doing so, she had saved Samuel too. Isn't that what we all need? A place, a person, something to believe in when the world seems determined to tear us down. For Clara and Samuel, it was the land that brought them together. But it was the work, the shared labor, the quiet companionship that healed them both. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Clara looked out at the ranch, no longer filled with despair, but with the quiet promise of new beginnings. She wasn't alone anymore. Neither of them were.
For Clara and Samuel, it had been a long road, filled with moments that tested both their strength and resolve. They had faced judgment, whispers, and cold stares from nearly every corner of Dry Creek. But through it all, they had stood together, quietly defying the world that tried to tear them apart. It's funny, isn't it, how quickly people can label others, how a man can be judged by his skin or the past he carries, without anyone ever bothering to understand the whole story. Samuel had been called everything under the sun: savage, animal, a beast. It didn't matter that he was a man with a history, with experiences that shaped him. No, to them, he was just another savage, nothing more, nothing less. And Clara? Well, they had plenty to say about her, too. A widow, a woman alone on a failing ranch, daring to live life on her own terms. The people of Dry Creek couldn't understand her either. They couldn't see why she would risk everything for a man like Samuel. But Clara didn't care. She had made her choice, and with each passing day, she grew more certain that it had been the right one. The ranch began to thrive under their combined effort, and for the first time in years, Clara felt hope stirring in her chest. But the community? They weren't so easily convinced. Dale Morrison, the richest man in the valley, was one of the loudest voices against Samuel's presence. His words were sharp, like daggers aimed at Samuel's character, and at Clara's decision to stand by him. Morrison saw Clara's ranch as an opportunity, and the sooner he could run her off, the sooner he could buy it for pennies on the dollar. The townspeople, fueled by fear and ignorance, followed Morrison's lead. They didn't see Samuel as a man who deserved respect, only as a threat to their sense of order. They whispered behind Clara's back, and some of them even suggested that the town should take care of the situation before things got out of hand. But Clara was stubborn, and Samuel was no coward. One evening, as the sky darkened with the promise of a coming storm, a fire broke out on the Garrett family's farm. The barn, dry and old, was quickly engulfed in flames, and the air was thick with smoke and panic. People screamed, running in every direction, trying to save what they could. Clara watched in horror as the fire roared, but something shifted in Samuel that night. Without hesitation, he rushed into the smoke, determined to save anyone he could. Clara followed, calling after him, but he was already lost in the blaze. Minutes passed like hours. The crowd gathered at the edge of the fire, helpless and watching in fear. And then, just when it seemed the barn would collapse, Samuel emerged, carrying a small child in his arms. It was Emma Garrett, her face streaked with soot, coughing from the smoke, but alive. The crowd went silent, and Clara's heart pounded in her chest as Samuel gently handed Emma over to her mother, Martha. "She breathes," Samuel said simply, his voice hoarse, but full of quiet strength. For the first time, the people of Dry Creek saw Samuel for what he truly was, a man of courage, a man of honor. The whispers stopped, replaced by stunned silence, and then
gratitude. Martha Garrett, her eyes wide with tears, kissed Samuel on the cheek, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered, over and over. That single act of bravery had changed everything. Samuel had saved a life. He had proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he was no savage. The following week, the town gathered for a barn raising at the Garrett farm. It wasn't just about the barn anymore. It was about something much bigger, a shift in how the community saw Samuel, and how they saw Clara, too. As the men worked alongside Samuel, lifting heavy beams and raising walls, the atmosphere began to change. They weren't just working next to him, they were learning from him. Samuel had a way of moving, a quiet confidence that spoke volumes. The men who had once crossed the street to avoid him now nodded in respect, asking him questions about the work, about his people's ways. And Clara? Clara, for the first time in years, didn't feel alone. She looked around at the men and women who had once judged her, who had once thought her foolish, and she saw something different in their eyes. It wasn't full acceptance, not yet, but it was something. A crack in the wall they had built around themselves, a crack that allowed the light of understanding to shine through. As the barn took shape, so did the bonds between them all. It wasn't just about rebuilding wood and nails, it was about rebuilding trust, rebuilding a community that had been broken by fear and prejudice. At the end of the day, when the barn was finally standing tall against the fading light of the sun, Paul Garrett, who had once looked at Samuel with suspicion, stepped forward. His voice was clear, strong, and he wasn't just speaking to Samuel, he was speaking to everyone. "Today," Paul said, his voice carrying across the gathering, "we've done more than build a barn. We've rebuilt something much more important. We've rebuilt our understanding of what it means to be a neighbor, a friend." And then, in front of everyone, Paul turned to Samuel and extended his hand. "Thank you. You have shown us what it means to be truly brave." The applause that followed was slow at first, but then it grew, filling the air with something that had been missing from this town for a long time: respect. That night, as Clara and Samuel stood on the porch looking out at the barn, the stars above them seemed brighter. The world felt just a little bit less heavy. Maybe things weren't perfect. Maybe they never would be. But in that moment, Clara realized something important. The world had started to see Samuel the way she had all along. And in doing so, they had started to see each other a little bit differently too. And isn't that what change is all about? Not just seeing things for what they are, but seeing them for what they could be. You know, there are moments in life that stick with you, not because of the grand gestures, but because of the quiet, unspoken ones. The ones where you realize that change, real change, is happening, even when no one is looking. Clara and Samuel's journey wasn't one of overnight miracles. No, it was built one day at a time, through hard work, stubborn hope, and the kind of quiet courage that makes all the difference when the world's weight seems too much to bear. At first, they were two people thrown together by circumstance. Clara, a widow, clinging to the last threads of her late husband's dreams, and Samuel, a man burdened by a past he couldn't shake. They were strangers in every sense of the word. But as they worked side by side, something began to change between them. It wasn't just the land they were fixing up. It was each other. They didn't talk much about their pasts at first, but as time passed and the hard work of ranching became the rhythm of their days, their silence spoke volumes. Samuel's quiet strength complemented Clara's determination, and soon the two of them were not just rebuilding the ranch, they were rebuilding themselves together. And that's the thing about human connection, isn't it? It doesn't always start with big words or grand gestures. It starts with respect, with seeing someone for who they really are, not the labels that society places on them. It starts with understanding, with offering help, and with showing up when it matters most. That's what Clara did for Samuel. And in return, Samuel did the same for her. In a world where everyone was quick to judge, quick to condemn, they found a quiet refuge in each other. They didn't need to explain themselves to anyone, not to the townspeople who whispered behind their backs, not to those who still called Samuel a savage. They knew what they had, and that was enough. The real test of their bond, though, came not from their work on the land, but from the world around them. It came when Samuel risked his life to save little Emma Garrett from the burning barn. That moment changed everything. It was the first time the people of Dry Creek saw Samuel for what he truly was. Not a savage, not a criminal, but a man. A man who, despite all the odds, still had the courage to do what was right, to protect life, no matter the cost. And suddenly, the town started to change too. Sure, it didn't happen overnight. Some people still whispered, still clung to their prejudices. But with every act of kindness, with every shared moment of work, the barriers between Clara, Samuel, and the rest of Dry Creek began to crumble. Slowly but surely, they started to see Samuel for who he was, a man who had his own story, his own pain, and his own hopes for the future. And through it all, Clara never wavered. She never faltered in her belief that love, respect, and acceptance were more powerful than any judgment the world could throw at them. Together, they proved that. There's something incredibly powerful about that, don't you think? The idea that love, when it's real, can bridge the widest gaps. It can tear down walls, break down barriers, and change hearts. That's what Clara and Samuel did. They showed that the world isn't as black and white as it seems, that people, no matter their past or the color of their skin, are capable of so much more than we give them credit for. As they stood there side by side on that porch, watching the stars begin to fill the sky, there was a feeling in the air, a sense of peace, of possibility. Clara had been through so much, had lost so much, and Samuel, well, he'd spent most of his life running, hiding, trying to survive. But together, they were creating something new, something real. It was more than just a ranch. It was a home. And it wasn't just the land they were building. It was their future, a future they were creating together with trust, with love, and with the understanding that they could face whatever came next as long as they stood side by side. Because that's what love does, right? It gives you the strength to face the world, to face the hard times, and to come out the other side stronger. And Clara and Samuel had found that in each other. So, what's next for them? I don't know. Maybe the road will get harder. Maybe the world will try to tear them apart again. But you know what? I think they'll be okay. Because when you've built something this strong, something built on mutual respect, on kindness, on love, there's nothing that can break it. Clara and Samuel had found something rare, something beautiful. And for the first time in a long while, they knew that together they could face whatever came their way. Maybe that's the real story here. The story of finding home, not just in a place, but in each other. The story of love that transcends everything.